Editor-in-Chief Rahul Shivshankar on the phone line with us. Rahul, we just heard the statement that came in from Russia, but the Prime Minister's message is clear. Keep aside your differences and work towards development.
Yes, Pratibha. Let's just take a deep breath here and take a slightly longer view of what is actually happening. You're seeing three visuals, very distinct visuals on your screens right now, viewers. And what are these visuals? These visuals are really of very high-powered meetings between three of the biggest actors on the world stage right now. On the extreme right, you have the External Affairs Minister of India meeting Mr. Blinken, who is the Secretary of State from the United States. On the extreme left, you have a meeting with the External Affairs Minister of China, Qin Gang, and of course, Dr. Shivshankar. And in the middle, you've just had a conversation that has ended between Sergei Lavrov, who is the Russian deputy, really, to Putin in all manner of speaking, as well as Mr. Shivshankar. And this is a very interesting troika, viewers. And India is playing this balancing act. It has to try and bring these three contending players together. Remember, the Chinese and the Russians are pretty much on one side when it comes to the Ukraine imbroglio. And, of course, America is on another extreme. It is with Ukraine, while the Chinese have supported the Russian position, and the Russians are, of course, the antagonists in Ukraine, in Europe. And amidst all of these three, India has to try and corner the elephant in the room. It has to use its diplomatic muscle, its diplomatic power to try and drive some sort of a consensus. Can India actually help build a consensus? Can it bring all these contending sides together? Can it shrink the differences over Ukraine? Can it be a peacemaker? Can it actually use some of its own non-partisan diplomatic muscle to try and get some of these individuals to begin to agree on at least the bare minimum, which is a ceasefire? Now, what is holding up this ceasefire? We must focus on that issue. Number one, the West has taken a very extreme position. It wants Russia to evacuate its aggression from Ukrainian soil. The Russians obviously will not concede to this. And there has been talk over the last 1 year as this Ukraine crisis has actually progressed, that there were certain solutions, and all it required was for the West to take a step back, create some sort of a buffer zone in eastern Ukraine, so that the Russians would have somewhat of a face saver. They would then evacuate their aggression from Ukraine without upsetting the balance of power in eastern Ukraine with regards to, obviously, the western part of Ukraine, i.e. that would remain an enclave of Russian influence, but not in the present context, one of conflict. But unfortunately, viewers, the West has decided to ramp up its assistance to Ukraine, and you have a situation now where Ukraine, bolstered by fresh deployment of weapons, etc., finds that it is again in a position to perhaps even counter Russia on its own soil. The Russians, of course, are not going to withdraw their aggression, especially if Putin thinks that this is coming at the cost of a defeat in Ukraine. So with the West now aligning itself even more firmly with Ukraine, you have a situation on your hands that presents really long escalation. Of course, is going around the various sanctions that have been put on Russia and is purchasing oil. The Chinese have come out in diplomatic support of Russia. In fact, in the UNSC and other UN forums, it has stood very firmly with Russia and against any further enlarging of the sanctions against Russia. So on the other side, of course, is India's own truculent relationship with China at this moment. So the Chinese, the Indian, and the United States, all three of them are at some level or the other jockeying right now to try and narrow the differences. Now, if you go back in time, if you remember the G20 summit in Japan, India actually helped build consensus there. rather not in Japan, but in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, in Bali. In fact, India was able to build consensus. It was able to actually bring together all these contending players to agree on certain wordings of an agreement. At that moment, if you remember, Sergei Lavrov had suddenly fallen sick and could not attend those meetings, but the Russians were represented by other officials. Here, Lavrov is present, and yesterday there was a situation where one of the state dinners, the American side did not show up. And if you look at the Western press, all of them are saying that the eyes of the world right now in India, because this is a challenge for India to try and bridge this yawning gulf between all of these contending players. These are world superpowers. India is, of course, in that league, top 5 economies of the world, a major influence here in Asia and also in Asia Pacific. So remember, we have a situation right now where India has to, at some level or the other, try and narrow this gap. It will be seen as a massive feather in India's diplomacy at a time when it has taken over the presidency of the G20. And if it can actually provide a breakthrough, you have a situation where the world will begin to look at India as a very serious player on the international stage that carries heft to bring people together on issues which have avoided consensus till now. So, Pratibha, that's really the larger picture that is emerging from these 3 meetings. And of course, Sergei Lavrov continues to brief the media on the conversation. And a short while back, we are hearing that he even sort of sarcastically expressed his regrets over the West diplomats who decided to stay away from the dinner yesterday, suggesting that the West were being slightly, and he's of course talking about America without naming them, were being rather childish in the manner that they conducted themselves and were trying to run away from a situation. Well, the point is that the optics are all there for everyone to see. India is the pivot right now here because it enjoys the presidency of the G20, and of course later this year all the state leaders will meet for the G20 summit, which of course the Prime Minister himself will host. He will host all these world leaders. But from here on, from February to around October, there is time for India to do its magic on the world stage. Remember, India is being built really as the Vishwaguru. Can it actually bring all these contending parties together? And are they resolved to allow India to play that role of peacemaker? Or mediator rather. That's something that we will have to see. And from what it appears as of now, Pratibha, there is a huge cachet, there is a huge trust factor, and India is seen as an effective interlocutor, and that really should carry a lot of weight. Remember, just today also, we've had the Italian Prime Minister visit India, Miss Giorgia Meloni, and she, of course, came out there and gave Mr. Modi a huge compliment, saying that he's one of the most widely respected, the most trusted world leaders. So more diplomacy is on view. Shivshankar is leading these talks, hopefully trying to rebuild this consensus, and one hopes that at the end of the day we can be the bridge. Let's go across to Sushant Sareen and General Bakshi. Sushant Sareen, how do you see this? This is an amazing photograph. 3 visuals on our screens: Blinken, Gang, and of course Sergei Lavrov, all meeting with India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Shivshankar, all happening in New Delhi. India has become the capital of diplomacy, really, for the next 2 days. How do you see this, Sushant Sareen?
Rahul, I would have really liked, if all these 3 frames were actually one frame. And then that magic which you were talking about would have happened. But that does not seem to be happening. So yeah, you're right. India has become, in a sense, the center of diplomacy in the world for the next couple of days. That's true. It is also correct that the kind of meetings that Dr. Shivshankar is having with all the important and relevant players in the world, I think is extremely critical, especially the 3 of them which you are showing on your screens. But despite the fact that we have equities with all the big players, I wouldn't include the Chinese in that, but we have good equities with the US, we have equities with the Russians, with the Europeans, everybody. I'm not very confident whether these will be enough to bring even some kind of a ceasefire. And the reason I say that is that war has its own logic, and that does not necessarily go by good sense. Though that goes by certain calculations which the protagonists in any war have of their own. And unless and until there are certain incentives built in or certain disincentives that players, either both players or all players or at least one player sees, in continuing a particular conflict, I don't see how you can broker any kind of peace or even a ceasefire. Because a ceasefire at this stage could very well mean a status quo as it exists today. Would that be acceptable to the Europeans and to the West and most of all to the Ukrainians? I'm not so sure. Anything beyond the status quo, would the Russians accept it? I don't think so. Like I said, neither any incentive nor any disincentive for the sides to not go down this road any further. So I think it's almost like a mission impossible, and it'll be nothing short of a miracle if you can even try and get some kind of a joint statement out, a joint communique out.
Yes.
And if that becomes impossible, then I don't think India should expend too much of its diplomatic capital or its energies in trying to get that communique out. I think there are many other very substantive issues which are going to be discussed, which are on the table, and perhaps it is better that India pushes for getting a better understanding and some agreement on those issues.